Hello everyone and welcome to our sixth video tutorial on judicial precedent. And in this video today, I'd like to talk to you about how to apply the law on precedent to a 15-mark scenario. Remember, precedent's from exam 1, and you could get a 5-marker or maybe even 2 5-markers on the topic of precedent. But you could also get a 15-mark scenario on precedent, and that's the slightly harder type of question. So I just wanted to run through how you would go about applying the law. So as always, because this is a scenario type question, in order to maximise your chances of getting full marks, you need to be using IDEA. So identify, define, explain, and apply. And this is going to look a bit hypothetical until I show you an exam question, which will help to illustrate this further. But usually what you'll see on a precedent scenario is that you are given a case from years ago that's a bit old-fashioned, a bit outdated, and the issue is, does your court in the current case in front of it today have to follow it? So in order to start this question, you would start off with whether the court has to follow the ruling, whatever the old case is, will depend on the rules of precedent. And then you define precedent, so we know that this is the source of law where past decisions create law for future judges to follow based on stare decisis. And then, as usual, you go into your E, and you're going to explain the 3 requirements for precedent to work. So you would outline the court hierarchy and outline the rules, which court binds which court and do they bind themselves. You would explain ratio and the fact that ratio is the binding part of the decision that will be followed in future cases, and law reports. So talking about the fact that they're vital, because if we don't write down what's decided in a case, it can't possibly be followed. You're then going to explain the different methods of avoiding precedent, so explaining that sometimes a court, like in your scenario, doesn't want to follow a past precedent, so you need to explain what they might be able to do in order to avoid it. So you'd explain distinguishing, reversing, overruling with the cases from your booklet. And then you would also need to explain the special rules for the Court of Appeal overruling its own past decisions, and also the Supreme Court overruling its own past decisions. So that would be by using Young and Bristol Aeroplane or the practice directions 3 and 4. Now, usually in the exam questions that you get, the question will often involve either the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeal, sometimes both of them. And the reason they're often in the scenarios is because the examiner wants to see if you can apply the special rules for those courts. And then, as always, once you've explained the law, you are going to apply the law back to your characters. So you need to have a look in your scenario and look at, in the old case you were given, which court made that decision. If it was a low court, of course, we don't have to follow it because they're not binding on anyone. But chances are it's going to be a Supreme Court decision, and you're going to be talking about the fact that you would expect that that would usually bind. Find what the ratio is from the case. So what was the binding thing from that old case? And probably in your scenario, you're not going to want to follow that old ratio. So at that point, you need to have a look and think about, do any of the general methods of avoidance apply? So if it was the Court of Appeal not wanting to follow the Supreme Court, the only thing they could really do is distinguish. So look at your scenario and think about, are there any facts that are different that we could possibly argue this shouldn't apply here? If it's Supreme Court or Court of Appeal, can they use their own special method of avoiding precedent if it was their own past decision that they don't want to follow? And then you're going to conclude on the likely outcome. So here what you're really saying is the court going to have to follow that old decision that you don't really like, or can we avoid it using one of the methods that you've explained? A little bit hypothetical at the moment, so hopefully it'll make a bit more sense if we look at a past exam question. So I've actually got the 2019 exam paper on the screen now. And if I scroll down, you can see that there were two little 5 markers here. But today we are interested in a precedent scenario. So if I scroll down here, you can see question number 3 on this paper was a question about judicial precedent. And you have to read the scenario and answer this question, and it's for 15 marks. And it's telling you that in 2013, the Supreme Court, in a fictitious case, so that's just telling you that this case, they've just made it up for the exam. So in this case of R and Phillips in 2013, self-defense for the crime of murder was only available if the defendant had been put in an unavoidable and imminent situation where life was at stake. So this is telling you that the Supreme Court has made a decision in this old case, and there's your ratio. And then we've got a new case, 2016, a character called Miriam has killed her husband Wynne. She's planned to do so over a period of months because he'd been repeatedly physically abused by him over many years. The prosecution is claiming that we have to follow R and Phillips because that's Supreme Court, and therefore, on the basis of that case, she can't have self-defense. So her case is now in the Court of Appeal, and they're considering their options. And you're being asked to use your knowledge of judicial precedent to advise the Court of Appeal on Miriam's case. So I'm going to switch back to my other screen now because I've highlighted this scenario for you so that I can explain it a little bit further. Switch my screens back to my PowerPoint now, and this is the same scenario we've just been looking at on the real exam paper, but I've highlighted some of the key points here. And I suggest that whenever you're looking at a precedent scenario, you do the same. So firstly, I've highlighted the dates. So in 2013, we've got a Supreme Court decision. And again, I've highlighted the court because that's very important to precedent. And I've highlighted the date of the most recent case, and that's in the Court of Appeal. And just by highlighting these dates and the courts, with your knowledge of precedent, you're going to know that the Court of Appeal is going to have to follow that Supreme Court decision probably. I've put in purple the ratio. So the ratio in this old case is that you can't have self-defense for murder unless your defendant is in an unavoidable and imminent situation where life was at stake. And when you look at what's happened in the most recent case, it's saying that Miriam has planned to do the killing because she's been abused for many years. So this is making the point that perhaps her situation was not unavoidable because she's planned to do it over a long period of time. And the fact that the other ratio says imminent, we know that that means almost immediately. And here in her situation, it's over a period of months. So arguably, it wasn't imminent because it was going on for a long period of time. So you can see here that in this most recent case, they're saying, well, she can't have self-defense because she was not in an unavoidable and imminent situation. So those are the issues. So we're going to consider now how you would answer this. Now, coming back to idea, you would start off by identifying that in this case, it's the Court of Appeal that need to consider how the rules of precedent are going to apply to Miriam. You're then going to define that precedent is based on stare decisis, which means to stand by what has been decided. And you could say at that point that on the basis of stare decisis, the Court of Appeal look like they're going to have to stand by that Supreme Court decision in the case of Phillips. And then we're going to go on to E, and we're going to explain. So you're going to explain how precedent works. So you would explain the court hierarchy and explain that the Supreme Court is at the top. It binds all the courts lower than itself. It generally binds itself, but it can use the practice directions, go on to the Court of Appeal, it's bound by the Supreme Court, etc. You'd explain ratio, and that the ratio is the binding part of the case that has to be followed. You'd explain your law reports. You'd explain the different methods of avoiding, such as reversing, distinguishing, overruling. And then you'd explain the special methods of avoiding that are available to the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal. And at that point then, you'd be on to your application, where you've got to apply all of your rules of precedent back to Miriam's situation. And I would go through everything you've just explained in order. So firstly, in my application, I would say this case is in the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal is below the Supreme Court in the court hierarchy, so it is bound by the Supreme Court. I would then say the ratio in this case, which has been recorded in a law report, is that you can only have self-defence for murder if there's an unavoidable and imminent situation. And the problem here is that it perhaps isn't imminent and perhaps isn't unavoidable. And then at that point, you can say the Court of Appeal wishes to avoid that Supreme Court decision. Now, if you think about the ways that the Court of Appeal can avoid the Supreme Court, it can't reverse it, it can't overrule it because it's not high enough. The only thing it could do is distinguish. And you've actually got quite a good case for distinguishing here, because you could talk about the fact that the Court of Appeal could argue that maybe this situation is different from the case of R and Phillips, because in this case, our character's been abused for a period of many years. And you could maybe even argue she's got battered women syndrome. So you could argue that this is a different situation, and therefore maybe we don't have to follow that. Now here, you can't apply Young and Bristol Aeroplane because the Court of Appeal is not trying to avoid its own previous decision, it's trying to avoid a Supreme Court decision. So the only thing it can do is distinguish. But at this point, what I would say is that perhaps the case can be distinguished, but if the Court of Appeal can't distinguish it, it would be possible for this court or this court case to then be appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court could possibly overrule its own previous decision in the case of R and Phillips using practice directions 3 and 4. And you could talk about the case of BRB and Harrington here and say that maybe, is it possible we could say that society has changed and that we need to update that older case now? So that's certainly an argument you could make. So in terms of your conclusion, you'd be saying, in general, Court of Appeal is going to be bound by this decision because they're higher than them in the hierarchy. They've probably got quite a strong case for distinguishing, which would leave Phillips intact and would just reach a different decision in this one. And then the only other possibility would be that they apply Phillips, it gets appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can overrule its own past decisions using the practice statement. And that would be your conclusion. So I hope you found that helpful on applying the law on judicial precedent.